Have you ever felt like life was playing a cruel trick on you? Like the universe decided to test just how much pain one heart could handle? That's exactly what happened to Eric Thompson on a cold Tuesday evening that would change his life forever. Picture this: a single dad, trying to move forward after losing the love of his life, walking into a restaurant for a blind date he never really wanted to go on in the first place. His best friend Ronald had been pushing him for months, saying it was time that Scarlett would want him to be happy again. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to see. The moment that woman turned around, Eric's entire world stopped spinning. His heart literally skipped a beat. Because sitting there, smiling nervously at him, was someone who looked exactly like his dead wife. I'm not talking about a resemblance. I'm talking about the same face, the same eyes, the same everything. And what happened next? Well, let me tell you. This story will make you question everything you thought you knew about fate, coincidence, and second chances. Before we continue, click the like button and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will surprise you. Also, tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing the reach of our stories. Eric had been dreading this evening for weeks. Ever since Ronald cornered him at the office and practically forced him to agree to this blind date, he'd been looking for excuses to cancel. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate his friend's concern. Ronald meant well. He always did. But the truth was, Eric wasn't ready. How could he be? It had only been 3 years since Scarlett passed away, and some days it still felt like yesterday. He could still smell her perfume on the pillows, still heard her laughter echoing through their home when Ellie did something silly. The grief had become a constant companion, something he'd learned to carry, but never quite got used to. That Tuesday morning, as he was making breakfast for Ellie, his 8-year-old daughter looked up at him with those big brown eyes that reminded him so much of Scarlett and asked if Daddy was going on a date. The innocence in her voice nearly broke him. Ronald had apparently mentioned it to his wife, who'd mentioned it to their daughter, who'd of course told Ellie at school. Kids and their inability to keep secrets. Eric knelt down to her level and gently explained that yes, Daddy was going to meet someone for dinner, but it didn't mean anything would change. Ellie surprised him by smiling and saying that Mommy would want Daddy to be happy. The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze him, even as it shattered his heart into a million pieces all over again. The restaurant Ronald had chosen was upscale but not pretentious, the kind of place with soft lighting and quiet corners, perfect for conversation. Eric arrived 15 minutes early because that's just who he was. Always punctual, a habit Scarlett used to tease him about. He sat in his car for 10 of those minutes, gripping the steering wheel, taking deep breaths, reminding himself that he could do this. It was just dinner, just one evening. If it went badly, he'd never have to see this woman again. Ronald had told him her name was Chloe, that she was a teacher, kind and funny, recently moved to town. That was all he knew. That was all he wanted to know going into this. As he finally stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, his hands were trembling slightly. The cool evening air did nothing to calm his nerves. He checked his phone one last time, saw a text from Ronald wishing him luck with way too many thumbs-up emojis, and pocketed the device. The hostess greeted him warmly, and when he mentioned he was meeting someone, she smiled knowingly and gestured toward a table near the window. That's when his entire life came to a screeching halt. The woman was facing slightly away from him, looking out the window, her profile illuminated by the warm glow of candlelight. And in that instant, before she even turned around, Eric felt something shift in the air around him. The curve of her neck, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, even the way she held herself, it all screamed Scarlett. His feet stopped moving. His breath caught in his throat. The room suddenly felt too hot, too small, like the walls were closing in. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. When she finally turned to face him, the smile on her lips froze as she took in his expression. And Eric? Eric felt like he'd been struck by lightning. It was Scarlett. It was impossible, completely impossible. But it was her. The same heart-shaped face, the same delicate features, the same green eyes that used to look at him with so much love. Even the small mole near her left eyebrow was in the exact same spot. His vision blurred for a moment, and he realized distantly that his body had gone into some kind of shock. The hostess was saying something. Chloe was standing up with a concerned look on her face, and Eric was pretty sure he was about to pass out right there in the middle of the restaurant. His legs felt like they'd turned to jelly, but somehow Eric managed to stay upright. The logical part of his brain was screaming that this was just a coincidence, that people have doppelgangers, that this woman just happened to look like Scarlett. But logic had no place in this moment. Because this wasn't just similar features or a passing resemblance. This was like looking at a ghost, a perfect recreation of the woman he'd loved more than life itself. Chloe's expression shifted from welcoming to worried as she took a step toward him. "Are you okay?" she asked, and Eric felt his blood turn to ice. Even her voice. Even her damn voice sounded like Scarlett's, that same melodic quality, the slight rasp on certain syllables. He must have looked absolutely insane, standing there frozen, his face drained of all color, staring at her like she'd risen from the grave. Other diners were starting to notice. The hostess asked again if everything was all right, and Eric somehow managed to force words past his lips. "I'm sorry, you look like someone I used to know." The understatement of the century. Used to know. As if Scarlett had been a casual acquaintance and not the center of his entire universe. Chloe's face softened with understanding, though she couldn't possibly understand what was really happening. "Oh, I get that a lot, actually," she said with a small laugh, trying to ease the tension. "Apparently I have one of those faces." One of those faces. Eric wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to run out of that restaurant and never look back. But he was raised to be polite, raised to see things through, and so he forced his legs to move forward. He forced himself to sit down across from her, even though every instinct was telling him to flee. Chloe sat back down too, and they were face to face now. Nothing between them but the small table and the impossible reality of this situation. Up close, it was even more uncanny. The exact shade of auburn in her hair, the way her eyebrows arched, the shape of her lips, everything was Scarlett. "I'm Chloe," she said, extending her hand across the table. Her hand. Even her hands looked the same, delicate with long fingers, the same hands that used to run through his hair, used to hold Ellie as a baby. Eric shook it, and the warmth of her skin against his nearly undid him completely. "Eric," he managed to say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. The waiter appeared, mercifully giving Eric a moment to collect himself as they ordered drinks. He asked for whiskey, neat, something strong to steady his nerves. Chloe ordered white wine, and even that small detail matched Scarlett's preference. This couldn't be coincidence. This couldn't be random chance. But what else could it be? Chloe was trying to make conversation, asking him about his work, mentioning that Ronald had told her he was in architecture. Eric responded on autopilot, his mouth forming words while his mind spun in circles. Every time she smiled, every time she laughed, every small gesture and expression was like a knife twisting in his chest. It was Scarlett's smile, Scarlett's laugh, Scarlett's way of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. How was this possible? How was any of this possible? The rational part of his brain kept trying to assert itself, kept reminding him that this was a different person, that DNA could create similar features, that this was all just a cosmic accident. But the heart doesn't listen to reason, and Eric's heart was screaming that something impossible was happening right in front of him. 3 years ago, on a rainy October morning, Eric's world had ended. Scarlett had been driving to her sister's house when a truck ran a red light and T-boned her car on the driver's side. The doctor said she died instantly, that she didn't suffer, as if that was supposed to be a comfort. Eric remembered getting the call at work, remembered the way time seemed to fracture and splinter, how he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process that the woman he'd woken up next to that morning was just gone. Ellie had been only 5 years old, too young to fully understand that mommy wasn't coming home, ever. The funeral was a blur of faces and condolences that meant nothing. People kept saying she was in a better place, that God had a plan, all those empty platitudes that people offer when they don't know what else to say. But there was no better place than here, with her family, with her daughter who needed her, with the husband who loved her more than anything in this world. The grief had been all-consuming, a black hole that threatened to swallow Eric completely. If it hadn't been for Ellie, if he hadn't had to stay strong for his little girl, he honestly didn't know if he would have made it through those first few months. And now here he sat, 3 years later, across from a woman who wore Scarlett's face like a mask. The coincidence was too perfect, too precise to be real. Eric's mind was racing through possibilities, each one more insane than the last. Could Scarlett have had a twin she never told him about? But he'd met her entire family, knew her history. Could this be some kind of elaborate scheme? But who would do that? And why? Was he losing his mind? Had the grief finally broken something fundamental in his brain? Chloe was still talking. Something about how she'd moved to town for a teaching position at the elementary school. And Eric forced himself to focus. He needed to know more about her. Needed to understand who she really was. "Where are you from originally?" he asked, interrupting her mid-sentence. If his abruptness surprised her, she didn't show it. "A small town about 3 hours north of here," she replied. "You probably haven't heard of it." "Millbrook?" Eric's hands gripped the edge of the table. Millbrook. That was where Scarlett had gone to college. The coincidences were piling up, one on top of another, until they didn't feel like coincidences anymore. They felt like something else entirely, something Eric didn't have a name for yet. The date, if it could even be called that anymore, continued in a surreal haze. Eric found himself studying Chloe's every movement, cataloging each similarity to Scarlett, looking for differences that might ground him in reality. But there were so few differences to find. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the small crinkle around her eyes when she smiled, even the way she cut her food, small, precise bites, exactly like Scarlett used to. At one point, Chloe mentioned she loved old jazz music, and Eric's fork clattered against his plate. Scarlett had been obsessed with jazz, had entire playlists of songs from the 30s and 40s that she'd play on Sunday mornings while making breakfast. "Are you sure you're okay?" Chloe asked again, real concern evident in her voice. "You seem really off tonight. If this is too much, too soon, I completely understand. Ronald mentioned you'd lost your wife, and I'm so sorry for your loss." The kindness in her voice, the genuine empathy, it was too much. Because of course she was kind. Of course she was understanding. Just like Scarlett would have been. Eric set down his fork, knowing he was about to say something that would make him sound completely unhinged. "Can I ask you something that's going to sound really strange?" Chloe nodded, her expression open and patient. Eric took a deep breath. "Have you ever been told you look exactly like someone? Not just similar, but exactly?" She seemed to consider this, her brow furrowing slightly. "Once, actually. About 6 months ago, I was at a conference, and this woman came up to me crying, saying I looked just like her daughter who'd passed away. It was really intense and sad." Eric felt his chest tighten. So he wasn't the first person to see this resemblance, to be struck by how much she looked like someone they'd lost. But that didn't answer the bigger question. That didn't explain how this was possible. "The thing is," Eric said carefully, choosing his words, "you look exactly like my late wife. Not similar. Identical. It's actually terrifying." Chloe's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then, to his surprise, she reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. "That must be so hard," she said softly. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. We can end this if you need to. No hard feelings." But Eric shook his head. Because as much as every fiber of his being was screaming at him to run, another part of him, a desperate, grieving part, couldn't let go of this moment. Couldn't walk away from this impossible second chance, even if it wasn't really Scarlett sitting across from him. Later that night, after the most surreal 2 hours of his life, Eric drove home in a daze. Chloe had been gracious and understanding when they'd parted ways, even giving him her number and telling him to call if he ever wanted to talk. She seemed to genuinely understand the complexity of the situation, the emotional landmine this had been for him. When Eric walked through his front door, Ronald's wife Jennifer was on the couch, having stayed late to watch Ellie. She took one look at Eric's face and knew something had gone terribly wrong. "That bad, huh?" she asked sympathetically. Eric sank into the chair across from her and put his head in his hands. "She looks exactly like Scarlett," he said, his voice hollow. "I mean exactly. Same face, same voice, same everything. It was like having dinner with a ghost." Jennifer's expression shifted from sympathy to shock. "What? That's impossible." "I know it's impossible," Eric said, looking up at her. "But I'm telling you, if I hadn't buried my wife 3 years ago, I would swear it was her sitting across from me tonight." Jennifer didn't know what to say to that, and Eric couldn't blame her. What do you say when someone tells you they've just met their dead wife's doppelganger? He checked on Ellie, who was fast asleep, her small face peaceful in the glow of her nightlight. Looking at his daughter, Eric felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. What was he doing? What was he thinking? This wasn't healthy. This couldn't possibly lead anywhere good. But over the next few days, Eric couldn't stop thinking about Chloe. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying every moment of that dinner, every smile, every laugh, every uncanny similarity. He kept Chloe's number in his phone, staring at it, his thumb hovering over the call button, never quite brave enough to press it. Ronald called to ask how the date went, and Eric gave him a heavily edited version, saying it was complicated, and leaving it at that. He couldn't explain it to Ronald, couldn't put into words what he'd experienced. On the third day, Ellie asked about the date over breakfast. "Did you like her, Daddy?" she asked innocently, swirling her cereal around her bowl. Eric didn't know how to answer that. Like wasn't the right word. Terrified by, obsessed with, haunted by, those were more accurate. "She was nice," he said carefully. "But it's complicated, sweetheart." Ellie studied him with that unnerving perception that children sometimes have. "Did she look like Mommy?" she asked, and Eric nearly choked on his coffee. "Why would you ask that?" Ellie shrugged. "You have that look you get when you're thinking about Mommy. The sad look." Out of the mouths of babes, Eric pulled his daughter close, holding her tight, wondering what the hell he was supposed to do with this situation. A week after the date, Eric broke down and did something he probably shouldn't have. He couldn't help himself. The questions were eating him alive, the coincidences piling up until they felt like something more than chance. He found Chloe's social media profiles. They were mostly private, but her profile pictures were public, and what he saw there made his blood run cold. Photos of her at the beach. The same beach where he'd proposed to Scarlett. Pictures of her at a concert, holding up a ticket stub for the same band that had been Scarlett's favorite. A post about her cat, a black cat with white paws, the same coloring as the cat Scarlett had owned in college. Each new similarity felt like the universe was playing an elaborate joke on him, or maybe like something far more impossible was happening. Eric started digging deeper, searching for any information he could find about Chloe. Where had she grown up? Who was her family? He found an old newspaper article about a high school volleyball team, and there she was, younger but unmistakable. The article was from 15 years ago, from Millbrook, confirming at least that part of her story. But it also meant that Chloe had been a real person, with a real history, long before Scarlett had died. So what did that mean? What did any of this mean? The breaking point came 2 weeks after the date. Eric was picking Ellie up from school when he saw Chloe across the parking lot, laughing with a group of other teachers. His heart stopped. He hadn't known she worked at Ellie's school. Ronald hadn't mentioned that particular detail. Before he could decide whether to approach her or hide, Ellie spotted her too. "Daddy, that's Miss Chloe. She's the nice substitute teacher who read to us yesterday." Ellie grabbed his hand and started pulling him in Chloe's direction. Eric wanted to resist, wanted to turn around and leave, but Ellie was too quick. They reached the group of teachers, and Chloe turned, her smile freezing when she saw Eric. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, while Ellie chatted happily about how much she'd enjoyed the story Miss Chloe had read. Then Chloe looked down at Ellie, really looked at her, and something changed in her expression. Her face went pale, her eyes widening with what looked almost like recognition. "This is your daughter?" she asked quietly, and Eric nodded, not trusting his voice. Chloe knelt down to Ellie's level, and Eric watched as his daughter smiled at this woman who wore her mother's face. "You have beautiful eyes," Chloe said softly to Ellie. "Just like your dad." But Eric saw the way her hand trembled slightly, saw the tears she was fighting back. She saw it too. She saw Scarlett in Ellie's features, saw the impossible connection that bound the three of them together in this surreal moment. That evening, after putting Ellie to bed, Eric finally called Chloe. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for his call. "I didn't know she was your daughter," were the first words out of her mouth. "I've been subbing at that school for 3 weeks, and I never made the connection. God, Eric, she looks so much like—" She trailed off, but Eric knew what she'd been about to say. "Like me. Like you. Like Scarlett. We need to talk," Eric said. "Face to face. There's something really strange happening here, and I need to understand what it is." They agreed to meet at a coffee shop the next morning, somewhere neutral, somewhere public where the weight of this impossible situation wouldn't crush them completely. Eric spent that night going through old photos of Scarlett, comparing them to the pictures he'd found of Chloe online. The similarities weren't just striking, they were identical in ways that defied explanation. Same facial structure, same body type, same mannerisms captured in still photographs. He found himself wondering if he was losing his grip on reality, if grief had finally broken something in his mind. But he'd seen Chloe in person twice now. This was real. This was happening. The question was why, and how, and what it all meant for the future he'd been trying so hard to build for himself and Ellie. The coffee shop was quiet when Eric arrived the next morning, the early hour keeping most of the usual crowd away. Chloe was already there, sitting in a corner booth, 2 cups of coffee already on the table. She'd ordered his drink the way he liked it, black with 1 sugar, and Eric wondered if that was another coincidence or if Ronald had told her. They sat in awkward silence for a moment, both uncertain how to begin this conversation. Finally, Chloe spoke. "I've been thinking about this non-stop," she said. "About the coincidences, about why this is happening. I even called my parents to ask if there was any possibility I'd been adopted, if there was anything in my family history they hadn't told me." Eric leaned forward. And? And they were confused and a little hurt that I'd ask. "I'm their biological daughter. They have baby pictures, birth certificates, everything. There's no mystery there." She took a sip of her coffee, her hands wrapped around the cup like she needed its warmth. "I looked you up too," she admitted. "Found some old photos of your wife online, from a charity event you both attended a few years ago. I can see why you reacted the way you did. The resemblance it's unsettling, even for me." Unsettling was putting it mildly. Eric pulled out his phone, navigating to a folder of photos he'd compiled. "Look at these," he said, turning the screen toward her. "This is Scarlett at the beach. This is you at the beach. Same beach, same pose, same everything." Chloe looked at the photos, and Eric watched as the color drained from her face. "This is impossible," she whispered. This level of similarity doesn't just happen randomly." "I know," Eric said. "Trust me, I know. I've been racking my brain trying to understand this. Is there any chance you and Scarlett were related? Could you have been distant cousins or something?" Chloe shook her head. "My family is from the Midwest, been there for generations." "Your wife was from where?" "Here. Born and raised on the West Coast. Her family tree is pretty well documented. No branches reaching toward the Midwest." They sat with that for a moment, the impossibility of it all settling over them like a heavy blanket. "There's something else," Chloe said quietly. "Something I haven't told anyone because it sounds insane. But I've been having these dreams lately, since I moved to this town. Flashes of places I've never been, of people I've never met, of a little girl with brown eyes." Eric felt his skin prickle. "What kind of places?" "A house with blue shutters and a big oak tree in the front yard. A kitchen with yellow walls and plants on the windowsill. A bedroom with photos on the dresser." Eric's hands started shaking. She'd just described his house, the house he'd shared with Scarlett, in perfect detail. The revelation hung between them like something alive and electric. Eric pulled up a photo on his phone of his house and showed it to Chloe. Her gasp was confirmation enough. "How is this possible?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been to your house. I've never even been to your neighborhood. But I've seen it, Eric. I've seen it in my dreams, and it's exactly this." Eric felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to step off into something unknown and potentially dangerous. "When did the dreams start?" "About a month ago, right after I moved here. They've been getting more frequent, more detailed. At first I thought they were just random, you know how dreams are. But then I met you, and now they're starting to make a terrible kind of sense." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "What if I'm not just someone who looks like your wife? What if I'm God? I don't even know how to say this without sounding crazy." "Say it," Eric urged, because he needed to hear someone else voice the impossible thought that had been growing in his mind. "What if somehow, some part of her is in me?" Chloe said. "What if this isn't coincidence? What if this is something else, something we don't have words for?" The rational part of Eric's brain was screaming that this was insanity, that they were both grieving people looking for meaning in random chance. But the rest of him, the part that had loved Scarlett with every fiber of his being, was listening. Over the next few weeks, Eric and Chloe fell into an unusual routine. They'd meet for coffee, sometimes lunch, talking for hours about the impossibilities that had brought them together. Eric learned that Chloe's birthday was the same day as Scarlett's, that she was allergic to shellfish, just like Scarlett, that she'd broken her left arm as a child, in the same place where Scarlett had broken hers. The coincidences kept piling up, one after another, until calling them coincidences felt like willful ignorance. But what was the alternative? Eric found himself drawn to Chloe in a way that felt both completely natural and deeply wrong. She wasn't Scarlett, he kept reminding himself. She was her own person, with her own history and personality. But being with her felt comfortable in a way nothing had since Scarlett died. She laughed at his jokes the way Scarlett used to, understood his silences without needing them filled. It was like coming home after a long, cold journey. Except the home wasn't quite right, was slightly off in ways he couldn't name. Ellie noticed the change in him, noticed that Daddy seemed happier, lighter. She asked if he was seeing Miss Chloe, and Eric didn't know how to answer that question. Were they dating? Was this grief masquerading as connection? Was he betraying Scarlett's memory by pursuing someone who looked exactly like her? Ronald finally cornered Eric at work one day, demanding to know what was really going on. Jennifer says you're acting strange, he said. And you've barely talked to me since that date. Did something happen? Did Chloe do something? Eric looked at his best friend, this man who'd stood by him through the worst period of his life, and decided he deserved the truth. He told Ronald everything. About the resemblance, about the dreams, about the mounting evidence that this was something more than just a random look-alike. Ronald listened in stunned silence, his expression cycling through disbelief, concern, and something that looked almost like fear. Eric, he said carefully when Eric had finished, I think you need to talk to someone. A therapist, maybe. Because what you're describing, it sounds like you're not processing Scarlett's death in a healthy way. And maybe Ronald was right. Maybe Eric was so desperate to have Scarlett back that he was projecting meaning onto random coincidences, creating a narrative that didn't exist. But then, how did he explain Chloe's dreams? How did he explain the fact that she'd described his house in perfect detail without ever having been there? Ronald didn't have answers to those questions, and neither did Eric. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than grief. He felt alive again, connected to something, even if that something was impossible to explain. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Chloe's mother called her one evening, and during their conversation, mentioned something she'd forgotten about until recently. When Chloe was born, there had been complications, and she'd needed a blood transfusion. The hospital had brought in an emergency donor, someone who'd matched Chloe's rare blood type. Chloe called Eric immediately to tell him this, her voice shaking with excitement and fear. Eric, I know this sounds insane, but what was Scarlett's blood type? Eric's mouth went dry. AB negative. It's really rare. Why? The line went silent for a long moment. That's my blood type, Chloe said finally. And the donor. My mother said the donor was a woman in her 20s who'd just moved to the area. She remembered because the woman was so kind, came to check on me in the hospital, even brought a little stuffed bear for my crib. Eric felt the room start to spin. What year was this? 28 years ago. August 15th to be exact. Eric did the mental math. 28 years ago, Scarlett would have been 22, fresh out of college. She'd been living in Millbrook for a year before moving to the coast. The timing lined up perfectly. Eric, Chloe's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. What does this mean? And that was the question, wasn't it? What did it mean that Scarlett's blood might literally flow through Chloe's veins? Did it explain the dreams, the uncanny resemblances? Was there something in Scarlett's DNA that had imprinted on Chloe? Some cellular memory transferred through that transfusion? Eric knew he needed to talk to Ellie about Chloe, about what was happening, before things went any further. His daughter deserved to understand, as much as an 8-year-old could understand something even the adults couldn't fully comprehend. One evening, as they were having dinner, Eric took a deep breath and dove in. Sweetheart, you know how I've been spending time with Miss Chloe? Ellie nodded, her face lighting up. I really like her, Daddy. She's nice, and she's pretty, and she makes you smile again. Eric felt his throat tighten. The thing is, Miss Chloe reminds me a lot of Mommy. She looks like her, acts like her sometimes, and that's both wonderful and really confusing for Daddy. Ellie tilted her head considering this. Do you think Mommy sent her? The question hit Eric like a freight train. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. I don't know, baby. Maybe. Or maybe it's just a really big coincidence. But I wanted you to know that if Miss Chloe and I keep seeing each other, it's not because I'm trying to replace Mommy. Nobody could ever replace Mommy. Ellie reached across the table and took her father's hand. I know that, Daddy. But maybe it's okay to have someone who reminds you of her. Maybe that's what you need. Eric pulled his daughter into a hug, marveling at her wisdom, her grace, her ability to see clearly what he'd been struggling with for weeks. Maybe Ellie was right. Maybe this was what he needed. The decision to pursue a real relationship with Chloe came gradually, built on weeks of conversations, shared coffees, and a growing connection that felt both completely new and deeply familiar. Chloe was careful to establish her own identity, to make sure Eric saw her as herself and not just as Scarlett's doppelganger. She had different tastes in some things, different opinions, different dreams for the future. But the core of who she was, the kindness and empathy and warmth, that felt like coming home. Their first official date, not a blind date or a coffee meeting but a real date, was dinner at a small Italian restaurant followed by a walk along the waterfront. Eric was nervous in a way he hadn't been since he first asked Scarlett out in college. What if this was all a huge mistake? What if he was setting himself up for more heartbreak? But when Chloe smiled at him across the table, when she reached for his hand as they walked, It felt right in a way that transcended logic. They talked about the future cautiously, neither wanting to rush into anything but both acknowledging that something significant was happening between them. Chloe met Ellie properly, not as a substitute teacher, but as Daddy's girlfriend. And watching them together made Eric's heart both break and heal at the same time. Ellie took to Chloe immediately, and Chloe was wonderful with her, patient and playful and genuinely interested in Ellie's world. As months passed, Eric and Chloe built something real together. The initial shock of the resemblance faded, replaced by genuine affection and partnership. Eric introduced Chloe to Ronald and Jennifer, who were skeptical at first, but came to see that this was more than just Eric seeking a replacement for Scarlett. Chloe became part of their lives, joining them for barbecues and game nights, becoming someone they valued in her own right. But the mysteries remained. Chloe's dreams continued, becoming more vivid and detailed. She'd sometimes describe moments from Eric and Scarlett's life together that she couldn't possibly know about, like the time they'd gotten lost on a road trip and ended up sleeping in their car under the stars, or the way Scarlett used to sing to Ellie when she was a baby. Each revelation was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder that whatever this was, it was beyond their understanding. They went to see a therapist together, trying to make sense of it all. The therapist listened to their story with professional composure, but even she had no easy answers. She talked about coincidence, about the power of suggestion, about how grief can make us see connections that aren't really there. But she also acknowledged that some things in this world defy explanation, that sometimes we have to accept mystery rather than forcing everything into neat categories. One evening, almost a year after that first fateful blind date, Eric took Chloe to Scarlett's grave. It was something he'd been thinking about for months, unsure if it was appropriate or helpful or completely insane. But Chloe had asked to go, had said she felt like she needed to pay her respects, to acknowledge the woman whose face she wore and whose love had shaped Eric into the man he was. They stood together in the quiet cemetery, autumn leaves falling around them, and Eric told Scarlett's headstone about Chloe. He told her about the impossibility of their meeting, about the connection they'd built, about how he was trying to honor Scarlett's memory while also allowing himself to love again. Chloe stood silently beside him, tears streaming down her face, and when Eric finished speaking, she knelt down and placed a hand on the cool marble. "Thank you," she whispered, "for loving Eric and Ellie, for being the kind of person worth remembering, for whatever cosmic accident brought me into their lives." Eric didn't know if he believed in an afterlife, didn't know if Scarlett could hear them, or if this was all just for their own benefit. But in that moment, standing in the cemetery with the woman who looked like his late wife but was entirely her own person, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced since the day Scarlett died. If you've made it this far in our story, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something that seemed impossible to explain? Have you ever felt like the universe was trying to tell you something? Drop a comment below and share your story, because sometimes the most incredible things happen when we least expect them. And hey, if this story moved you, if it made you think about love and loss and the mysterious ways our lives intersect, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We share stories like this every week, real stories about real people facing the extraordinary in their ordinary lives. Ring that notification bell so you never miss when we post something new. Because trust me, the stories we have coming up are going to blow your mind just as much as Eric and Chloe's did. So what happened to Eric and Chloe? Well, life isn't a fairy tale, and they didn't ride off into some perfect sunset. What they built was something messier and more real than that. They moved in together after dating for 18 months, taking that leap of faith that any couple takes when they decide to fully merge their lives. Ellie got the new bedroom she'd been hoping for, decorated in purple and gold, because Chloe learned that's what she loved. They became a family, not replacing the family that was, but creating something new from the ashes of grief and the miracle of impossible coincidence. Chloe's dreams about Scarlett eventually faded, or maybe Eric just stopped asking about them, accepting that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They talked about the resemblance less and less, until eventually it was just a fact of their lives rather than the defining characteristic of their relationship. People who didn't know their history just saw a happy family, a father, and his daughter and his partner building a life together. Those who did know the story had their own opinions, some thinking it was beautiful, others finding it unsettling. But Eric had learned something important through all of this. He'd learned that love doesn't follow rules, that grief has its own timeline, and that sometimes the universe gives us exactly what we need in the strangest possible package. Was Chloe a gift from Scarlett, sent to heal her family's broken hearts? Was she just a random woman who happened to look like someone else? Or was the truth something more complex, something that existed in the space between coincidence and miracle? Eric didn't have those answers, and he'd made peace with not having them. What he knew was that he'd been given a second chance at happiness, and he wasn't going to waste it by questioning the how and why. He loved Chloe for who she was, not just for who she reminded him of. And in the end, isn't that what love is supposed to be? Seeing someone fully, accepting them completely, and choosing them every single day, regardless of the impossible circumstances that brought you together. Until next time, keep choosing love, keep believing in second chances, and I'll see you in the next video with another story that proves life is stranger than fiction.